I was nothing more than a whisper in my son's home, an afterthought, a shadow that moved between rooms folding laundry with practiced hands and setting tables with an attention to detail no one ever noticed. My daughter-in-law Meredith had perfected the art of looking through me, her eyes sliding past mine like I was made of smoke. My son James had grown so accustomed to my silence that he'd forgotten I ever had a voice worth hearing. They never asked who I was before I became Catherine Mitchell mother and widow, before I became the woman who remembered everyone's favorite foods and birthday dates, before I became the convenient appendage to their busy lives. They assumed my story began and ended with motherhood, with marriage, with the quiet routine of keeping their lives orderly while staying carefully out of focus. I don't know exactly when I started to disappear. It happened so gradually that I hardly noticed it myself. One day I was voicing opinions at dinner, the next I was simply nodding along. One month I was suggesting weekend plans, the next I was babysitting their plants while they took spontaneous trips to wine country. The transformation from person to fixture was nearly imperceptible, a slow erosion rather than a sudden collapse. Meredith preferred me this way. I could see it in the relaxation of her shoulders when I excused myself from conversations about politics or art, the slight nod of approval when I retreated to the kitchen during their dinner parties. She liked me best when I was useful, but unseen like a well-designed appliance. That morning started like any other. The April sun pushed through the kitchen blinds in thin golden strips across the counter as I prepared breakfast. The familiar rhythm of the household hummed around me. James's shower running upstairs, Meredith's heels clicking across the hardwood as she finished dressing the coffee maker, gurgling its final sighs. I moved between tasks with practiced ease, cracking eggs into a bowl while toasting bread, setting out the creamer. Meredith insisted on having, though she complained about the calories. "Morning, Mom," James murmured as he entered the kitchen, eyes glued to his phone. His hair was still damp, his tie slightly crooked. At 42, he looked more like his father each day, the same furrowed concentration between his brows, the same habit of rubbing his thumb against his wedding ring when thinking. "Good morning," I replied, sliding a plate of eggs toward him. "There's fresh coffee." He nodded without looking up, reaching blindly for the mug I'd already placed beside his plate. His fingers found it effortlessly muscle memory from hundreds of identical mornings. Meredith swept in moments later, immaculate, in a charcoal pencil skirt and cream blouse, her dark hair twisted into a sleek knot. At 38, she commanded attention, without seeming to seek it, something I once admired, before I realized how that same quality could be wielded like a weapon. "Is there granola left?" She asked no one in particular, though I was the only one listening. I reached for the jar before she finished her question. "On the top shelf. I picked up more yesterday." She took it with a distracted, "Thanks," her eyes already moving to the calendar on the refrigerator. "Don't forget we have the Hendersons coming this weekend," she said to James. "Did you confirm the wine delivery?" James responded, scrolling through emails. I stood by the sink, sipping my own coffee, invisible again. They spoke around me, through me, past me, discussing plans I wasn't part of, jokes. I wasn't privy to a life I observed, but didn't participate in. When they left for work, the silence in the house settled around me like an old friend. I wiped down the counters, rinsed the dishes, straightened the chairs. The morning light stretched across the floor, warming the space they'd left vacant. In these quiet moments, I sometimes caught glimpses of who I used to be, a woman with opinions that mattered, with a voice that carried weight. I moved through the rooms, picking up scattered items. James's discarded tie from the weekend Meredith's magazine left, splayed on the coffee table. this house had been mine once. I'd chosen the paint colors selected, the fixtures arranged, the furniture. Now it felt like a museum I was hired to maintain, keeping everything pristine for the real inhabitants. In my bedroom, once the guest room, now my designated corner of the house, I kept a small bookshelf. Nothing expansive, nothing that would encroach on Meredith's carefully curated aesthetic, but enough to hold what mattered dog-eared paperback novels, a few biographies, and hidden behind them legal journals I hadn't opened in years. I ran my fingers along their spines that morning, feeling the embossed letters. The Columbia Law Review, Harvard Law Journal, testimonies from cases long closed, reminders of days when people leaned forward to hear what I had to say, when my words could change the course of someone's life. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Meredith's number flashed on the screen. "Catherine, can you pull out the good linens for Saturday? The ones with the embroidered edges. And maybe check if we still have those crystal salt cellars my mother gave us. I want to use them for the dinner. Not hello. Not how are you. Just instructions delivered with the assumption of compliance." "Of course," I replied. "Anything else? Maybe those candles from Christmas. The unscented ones." A pause. "Actually, just leave everything out. I'll rearrange when I get home, because whatever I might do wouldn't be quite right. Never quite what she envisioned. I'll take care of it," I said. "Great, thanks." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood holding the silent phone, wondering when exactly I'd become an extension of Meredith's to-do list, rather than a person she spoke to. When had my son stopped seeing me? When had I stopped expecting him to? The afternoon stretched before me, empty and full all at once. I would wash the linens, find the salt cellars, locate the candles. I would prepare the house for a dinner I wouldn't be invited to join. I would make myself useful, reliable, necessary, in the way background elements always are noticed only in their absence. Later, as I ironed the napkins with careful precision, smoothing each crease with my palm, I caught my reflection in the laundry room mirror. A woman with silver-streaked hair and careful eyes. A woman whose hands bore the soft wrinkles of time, but still moved with dexterity and purpose. A woman who had argued before judges and juries, who had once commanded attention with nothing but her voice and the force of her convictions. A woman no one in this house truly knew. Living with my son and his wife wasn't supposed to be permanent. When James first suggested I move in after selling my house, it seemed like a practical arrangement. "Just until you figure out your next step, Mom." He'd set his arm around my shoulders. "No rush. That was 5 years ago." At first, I'd been grateful. Widowhood had hit me harder than expected, leaving me adrift in a life suddenly emptied of companionship. The house Richard and I had shared for decades felt cavernous without him, each room an echo chamber of memories. When James offered me a space in their home, a temporary landing spot while I regained my footing, it seemed like an anchor in turbulent waters. I arrived with only what would fit in the guest room. Clothes, books, a few photographs, and a wooden box of professional mementos I couldn't bear to part with. "The rest can go in storage," Meredith had suggested with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Until you find your own place. Those first months, I made myself indispensable." I rose early to prepare breakfast, stayed up late. Folding laundry filled the refrigerator with home-cooked meals. I watched their schedules, learned their preferences, anticipated their needs before they voiced them. It was my way of saying thank you, of earning my keep in a space that wasn't truly mine. "Mom, you don't have to do all this," James would occasionally say, watching me scrub a pot or vacuum the stairs. But his protests were half-hearted, his attention already drifting back to his laptop or phone, and Meredith never protested at all. She simply adjusted to my presence like adapting to a convenient new appliance, useful but ultimately unremarkable. As weeks turned to months, and then to years, I became part of the background rhythm of their home. The woman who knew where the spare light bulbs were kept. The one who remembered to water the plants and renew prescriptions. The quiet figure who disappeared when company arrived and reappeared when dishes needed washing. I told myself it was temporary, that I was saving money for my next chapter, that I was helping my son and his wife navigate their busy careers. But somewhere along the way, temporary calcified into permanent, and helping became serving, and I couldn't quite pinpoint when the shift occurred. The morning kitchen conversations grew shorter, then sparse, then nearly non-existent. My suggestions about dinner or weekend plans were met with distracted nods or gentle course corrections. "Actually, we were thinking Thai tonight, Mom." "We already made plans with the Prestons, but thanks." I learned to stop offering. I learned to wait to be told. Meredith's friends came and went, their voices echoing through the house in bursts of laughter. I wasn't invited to join. They'd glance at me with polite smiles as I served cheese platters or refilled wine glasses, their eyes sliding away just as quickly, dismissing me as part of the furniture. Sometimes from the kitchen, I'd overhear snippets of their conversations, careers, advancing investments, growing vacations planned, the currency of success in their world, a world that had no place for a woman my age unless she was serving or reminiscing. It wasn't that they were cruel. It was that I had become invisible, a common fate for women past a certain age. We become background characters in younger people's stories, our own narratives deemed complete or irrelevant. But my story wasn't finished. It had simply gone silent. On the rare occasions when I ventured an opinion at dinner about a news story or a book I'd read, James would listen with the patient indulgence one offers a child. Meredith would wait for me to finish, then seamlessly redirect the conversation, as if I hadn't spoken at all. Speaking of books, she might say, Alicia was telling me about this amazing novel her book club just finished. And just like that, I'd be erased again. I started spending more time in my room reading the books no one asked about, watching old legal dramas that reminded me of courtrooms where my voice had once mattered. I took longer walks around the neighborhood, nodding to neighbors who didn't know my name. I drafted emails to old colleagues that I rarely sent, unsure if they'd even remember me after all this time. The woman I had been, Catherine Mitchell J.D., who had once argued successfully before the state Supreme Court, felt increasingly like a character I'd invented, someone who existed only in my memory. One evening, as I sat alone at the kitchen table long after James and Meredith had gone to bed, I found myself staring at my reflection in the darkened window. The house was silent, except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beyond our manicured neighborhood. "Who are you now?" I whispered to the woman in the glass. She stared back, her eyes tired but alert, her mouth set in a line that spoke of patience tested beyond its limits. She looked like someone waiting for permission, for recognition, for the chance to exist again, as more than a convenience. I touched the window, tracing the outline of my face with a fingertip. Tomorrow would be like today. I would make breakfast. I would do laundry. I would remind James about his dentist appointment. I would stay out of Meredith's way while she prepared for her weekend gathering. I would continue to fade until someone remembered to look for me, or until I remembered how to be seen. Meredith's weekend gatherings were elaborate affairs disguised as casual get-togethers. "Just a few friends coming over," she would say, But the preparation always involved days of planning countless trips to specialty stores and a complete transformation of the living and dining areas. This particular Saturday was no exception. "I'm thinking we'll do a Mediterranean theme," she announced over breakfast 3 days before. Simple, elegant, nothing too fussy. James nodded absently, his attention divided between his plate and his phone. I knew from experience that nothing too fussy meant at least 5 appetizers, a multi-course meal, and desserts that would require specialized equipment to prepare. "I could make that olive tapenade you liked last time," I offered, carefully keeping my voice neutral, neither too eager nor too hesitant. Meredith's eyes flicked to mine briefly. "Oh, that's sweet, Catherine. But I'm ordering from that new place on 5th. Their chef trained in Barcelona." She turned back to James. "Did you call about the wine delivery?" And just like that, I was dismissed. I spent the next 3 days watching the house transform under Meredith's direction. Fresh flowers appeared in every room. New throw pillows replaced the old ones on the sofa. Scented candles that made my nose itch were strategically placed on side tables and bathroom counters. I made myself useful in the periphery, polishing silverware, ironing napkins, arranging cheese boards. Tasks that needed doing but wouldn't interfere with Meredith's vision. Tasks that would allow me to retreat unseen when the actual event began. The morning of the gathering, I rose earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the pre-dawn light casting everything in shades of blue-gray. I moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, preparing a breakfast no one had asked for, but that would be eaten nonetheless. The familiar ritual was soothing, measuring coffee grounds, whisking eggs, slicing fruit in even pieces that would be arranged in a spiral on the serving plate. James appeared first, shuffling into the kitchen in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, his hair still mussed from sleep. "Morning, Mom," he mumbled, reaching for the coffee. "Good morning," I replied, sliding a plate of eggs and toast toward him. "Did you sleep well?" He made a non-committal sound around a mouthful of food. "Thanks for this," he added after swallowing, gesturing vaguely at the breakfast. It was a small acknowledgement, but I found myself pathetically grateful for it. For the brief moment when he actually saw me, recognized my contribution. I savored it silently as I turned back to the stove. Meredith arrived moments later, already dressed in yoga pants and a fitted top, her dark hair pulled into a sleek ponytail. She eyed the breakfast spread with the same critical assessment she applied to everything in her domain. "Is that sourdough?" she asked, picking up a slice of toast. "Yes, from that bakery you like on Maple Street," I replied. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and took a small bite. "I need to go over the schedule for today," she said to James. "The first delivery arrives at 11, so someone needs to be here to accept it." "I have that call at 11, James said, not looking up from his phone. "I'll be here," I offered. "I can sign for anything that comes." Meredith glanced at me. "Great," she said, though her tone suggested it wasn't really a choice. Of course I would be here. Of course I would help. What else would I be doing? "The caterer needs access to the kitchen by 3. The guests arrive at 6. I nodded, memorizing the timeline, though I knew I wouldn't be part of the evening's events. I would help prepare, then disappear. That was our unspoken arrangement. As the day progressed, the house came alive with activity. Deliveries arrived in waves, flowers, wine, specialty ingredients, rental items for the table. I signed for each one, directing delivery people to appropriate locations with quiet efficiency. Meredith moved through it all like a conductor, checking items off lists, rearranging furniture, testing lighting levels. By late afternoon, the transformation was complete. The dining table gleamed with candles and fresh flowers. The living room had been subtly rearranged to create conversation areas. Music played softly through hidden speakers, something Mediterranean and acoustic that Meredith had carefully selected. I had just finished arranging the last of the serving platters when Meredith appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking slightly harried despite her perfect appearance. "Catherine, would you mind helping the caterer with the final setup I need to change before everyone arrives?" "Of course," I said, though we both knew it wasn't a request. She paused, her eyes scanning the kitchen. "Everything looks good," she said, and for a moment I thought she might actually thank me. Instead, she added, "Make sure they use the blue serving platters for the seafood, not the white ones." "I will," I promised. She nodded and turned to leave, then stopped. "Oh, and Catherine, maybe wear that navy cardigan tonight if you're planning to join us for a bit. The beige one is a little..." She trailed off, gesturing vaguely. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but kept my expression neutral. "I'll probably just stay in my room once everyone arrives. I have a new book I'm excited to start." Relief flickered across her face so quickly I might have imagined it. "Whatever you prefer, of course. But you're welcome to join for a little while if you'd like." The words were right, but the tone made it clear what she actually preferred. I simply nodded and she disappeared upstairs, the matter settled. I helped the caterers set up, directing them to pantry items and extra serveware when needed. I adjusted flower arrangements, lit candles, and made sure the temperature in each room was perfect. I did all this knowing that when the first guests arrived, I would fade into the background, becoming another service provider, rather than a member of the household. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I retreated to the kitchen as James and Meredith greeted their first guests with exclamations and laughter. More arrived shortly after, women in carefully casual outfits that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, men in designer jeans and crisp button-downs. The sound of conversation and clinking glasses soon filled the house. I busied myself in the kitchen making sure wine bottles were opened and ready, that the caterers had everything they needed. Occasionally, I'd emerge to refill a platter or remove empty glasses, moving quickly and quietly through spaces where I didn't belong. Most guests barely noticed me. Those who did offered polite smiles before returning to their conversations. I was part of the evening's machinery, necessary but unremarkable, until Lisa noticed me. Lisa was new to Meredith's circle, a colleague from work with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue. I had overheard Meredith describing her as brilliant but intimidating earlier that week. She caught me as I was replacing a tray of olives on the coffee table. "You must be James's mother," she said, her voice cutting through the background noise. I straightened, surprised at being directly addressed. "Yes, I'm Catherine. I'm Lisa. I work with Meredith." She gestured to the tray I had just set down. "These look delicious. Did you make them?" "No, they're from the caterer," I replied. She nodded, taking a sip of her wine. "So what do you do, Catherine, besides help with these lovely parties?" The question caught me off guard. It had been so long since anyone at one of these gatherings had asked me anything about myself. Before I could formulate a response, Meredith appeared beside us, her smile tight. "Lisa, there's someone I want you to meet," she said, placing a hand on the other woman's arm. "John's wife is also in marketing." Lisa allowed herself to be guided away, but not before giving me a curious look over her shoulder. I returned to the kitchen, my heart beating unusually fast. It was such a simple question, "What do you do?" But it had left me speechless. Because what did I do now? Exist in the margins of my son's life. Fold laundry that wasn't mine. Remember birthdays no one else bothered to mark on calendars. From the kitchen doorway, I watched the party unfold. Meredith was in her element, moving from group to group, laughing at the right moments, touching arms to emphasize as connections, refilling glasses with practiced grace. James stood with a cluster of men near the fireplace, discussing something that required expansive hand gestures and occasional bursts of laughter. They looked so comfortable in their skin, so certain of their place in the world. I envied that certainty, that easy confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and having others recognize it too. I was about to retreat to my room when I heard my name. Not directly addressed to me, but about me floating from a conversation just beyond the dining room. I shouldn't have listened, but I did. Catherine's so sweet, Meredith was saying to a small group that included Lisa and 2 other women I didn't recognize. She's been such a help since moving in with us. Has she lived with you long? One woman asked. About 5 years now. It was supposed to be temporary, but you know how these things go? Meredith's laugh was light-practiced. She helps around the house, and it's nice for her to have company. What did she do before retiring? Lisa asked. There was genuine curiosity in her voice. There was a brief pause, and I held my breath. Oh, this and that, Meredith replied vaguely. She was a homemaker mostly. Very traditional, very hands-on. Not really the career type. I felt something cold and hard form in the pit of my stomach. She helped raise James, of course, Meredith continued. But I don't think she ever had much formal education. More of a practical person, really good with domestic things. Someone murmured something I couldn't hear. Exactly, Meredith agreed with a laugh. Not everyone needs college. She's happy with her books and her cooking shows. Some people just aren't built for academic pressure. The laughter that followed was polite, mild, not meant to wound. But it cut through me all the same. I stood frozen in the doorway, my hands gripping the serving tray so tightly, my knuckles turned white. The conversation had already moved on, flowing to other topics, other people. Meredith's casual dismissal of my entire life before her, her complete mischaracterization of who I was, who I had been, hung in the air between us, invisible to everyone. But me. Not just wrong, but confidently wrong. Smugly, carelessly wrong. As if my actual history was so unimportant, so inconsequential, that it wasn't even worth knowing correctly. I set the tray down on the counter with a soft click and walked away. Not rushing, not drawing attention, just quietly removing myself from a space where I had been reduced to a caricature. I moved through the hallway past guests who didn't notice me into the sanctuary of my small room, where I closed the door with a gentle finality. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, though. Perhaps I should have been angry. Not exactly hurt, though the pain was undeniable. It was more like recognition, a clear-eyed understanding of how thoroughly I had allowed myself to be erased. I had spent 5 years in this house being careful, helpful, undemanding. I had made myself small to fit into the corners they had allocated for me. I had accepted their narrative of who I was because it seemed easier, kinder, less disruptive. But in doing so, I had become complicit in my own disappearance. The party continued beyond my door. The sounds of laughter and conversation, a distant backdrop to my thoughts. I looked around my room at the neatly made bed, the modest bookshelf, the single photograph of Richard and me on our 30th anniversary. It was a clean, comfortable space, but there was something impersonal about it, as if I had been house-sitting for years rather than living. My gaze drifted to the top shelf of my closet, where a wooden box sat partially hidden behind winter sweaters and old photo albums. I hadn't opened it in years, not since moving in. It felt too much like looking backward when I should have been looking forward. Too much like clinging to a past that no longer seemed relevant in the present Meredith and James had constructed around me. But now, with Meredith's words still echoing in my ears, that box seemed to pulse with importance. It contained the evidence of a life she had just casually erased, proof that I had been more than a cooking-cleaning background figure. Proof that I had once stood in courtrooms and boardrooms where my words changed lives. Proof that before I became invisible, I had been someone worth seeing. I stood up slowly, my decision made. I would open the box. I would remind myself of who I had been. And then perhaps I would find a way to become visible again, not just to them, but to myself. Because the woman who had folded herself into silence for 5 years was still there beneath the cardigan, Meredith deemed too beige behind the polite smiles and careful questions. She was waiting, watching gathering strength, and soon, very soon, she would speak. Ta-ta! The wooden box felt heavier than I remembered. I lifted it down from the closet shelf, carefully brushing away a thin film of dust from its lid. The party sounds continued in the distance. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses. But they seemed to belong to another world entirely as I sat on my bed, the box beside me like a visitor from a forgotten life. I ran my fingers over the inlaid pattern on the lid, tracing the curves and whorls of the walnut veneer. Richard had given me this box on our first anniversary, long before we could afford extravagant gifts. "For your important papers," he had said with a smile. "God knows you'll have plenty of them." He had been right. Over the years, the box had filled with the documentation of a life lived purposefully, my law degree from Columbia copies of landmark cases. I had argued commendations from judges and colleagues, newspaper clippings that mentioned my name in connection with victories that had changed people's lives. I had been somebody. Not just a mother, not just a wife, though those roles had mattered deeply to me, but a professional with expertise, with authority, with impact. With trembling fingers, I lifted the lid. The scent that rose from the box was faintly musty, but oddly comforting. Old paper, faded ink, the particular smell of memories preserved. On top lay my diploma, protected in a clear plastic sleeve that had yellowed slightly with age. I removed it carefully, holding it up to catch the light from my bedside lamp. Columbia University School of Law. It proclaimed in elegant script. Catherine Ann Mitchell, Juris Doctor. The date stared back at me, evidence of a time when I had stood proud in cap and gown, my young son holding my hand, my husband beaming beside me. I had graduated with honors, had offers from 3 prestigious firms before I even passed the bar. I had chosen the smaller firm because they promised flexibility for a mother with a young child, a rarity in those days, and I had risen to partner within 7 years. Beneath the diploma lay newspaper clippings carefully preserved in plastic sheets. Mitchell wins. Landmark case for workplace discrimination. One headline announced. There was my younger face, serious and determined briefcase in hand, as I descended courthouse steps. Another article detailed my work on a complex environmental lawsuit that had forced a major corporation to clean up toxic waste in a low-income neighborhood. I found letters from clients thanking me for changing their lives, for fighting when others wouldn't, for seeing injustice and refusing to look away. I found photographs of the retirement party the firm had thrown for me after 27 years of service colleagues raising glasses, speeches being made a plaque that now sat in storage because Meredith thought it didn't match her decor scheme. Next came financial records evidence of the career I had built, the security I had created, my retirement account statements, the proceeds from the sale of my house after Richard died, money that now sat in investments generating the income that allowed me to contribute substantially to this household, though they never acknowledged it. And finally, at the bottom of the box, a small leather-bound journal. My case notes from my first year practicing law, filled with observations, strategies, fears overcome, and victories hard won. The handwriting was firmer than mine now, more ambitious in its strokes, but undeniably me. I opened to a random page and read, "Today, Judge Harmon finally ruled in our favor after 3 months of deliberation. Mrs. Ramirez cried when I told her, 23 years working for that company, sexually harassed for the last 5, and finally, someone believed her. Someone made it right, that someone was me. I will never forget her face when she heard the verdict. This is why I became a lawyer. This moment, this justice." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't wipe them away. I let them fall onto my hands, onto the box of memories I had tucked away as if they didn't matter. As if I didn't matter. The party beyond my door seemed to grow louder for a moment. Someone had put on music with a stronger beat, and laughter rose in response. I could picture Meredith in the center of it all, glass in hand, confidently holding court. I could imagine her telling someone else about her sweet, simple mother-in-law with no education and no ambition beyond domesticity. The image no longer hurt. Instead, it clarified something I had been feeling for months, maybe years. I was not angry at Meredith for misunderstanding me. I was disappointed in myself for allowing it. I had shrunk myself to fit into their narrative. I had stopped speaking of my accomplishments because it seemed boastful or irrelevant. I had accepted their perception of me as a woman whose only value lay in service rather than intellect or achievement. I had become the person they needed me to be, rather than insisting on being the person I actually was. But the woman who had argued before judges and juries was still here. The woman who had helped craft legislation, who had mentored younger attorneys, who had once been sought out for her opinions, she hadn't disappeared. She had just gone quiet. Too quiet. I gathered the contents of the box and arranged them on my bed in chronological order, the story of my professional life laid out like evidence in a case I was building. Not against Meredith or James, but for myself. A reminder of what I had been, what I still was, beneath the layers of silence I had wrapped around myself. The party would end eventually. The guests would leave. The caterers would clean up and the house would return to its usual rhythm. Meredith and James would go back to seeing me as they always had, useful, unobtrusive, simple. But something had changed. I had changed. Or rather, I had remembered. I carefully returned each item to the box, but I didn't put it back on the high shelf. Instead, I slid it under my bed, where I could reach it easily. A reminder, a talisman, a promise to myself. Tomorrow would be different. I didn't know exactly how yet, but as I closed my eyes that night, listening to the last guests departing to Meredith's effusive goodbyes and James's tired laughter, I felt something unfurling inside me, something that had been dormant for too long. The woman who had once stood before the state Supreme Court and never wavered was waking up, and she had quite a lot to say. The morning after the party, I woke earlier than usual. The house was still and silent, Meredith and James likely sleeping off the late night and multiple glasses of wine. Pale dawn light filtered through my curtains, casting soft shadows across the floor. Instead of getting up immediately to start breakfast as I usually would, I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking. Something had shifted inside me the night before, a tectonic change that had yet to show itself on the surface. but had fundamentally altered my internal landscape. I felt both lighter and more solid, as if remembering who I had been had restored a piece of myself I hadn't realized was missing. I rose quietly and dressed with unusual care, selecting a pair of tailored gray slacks and a blue cashmere sweater I rarely wore because it seemed too nice for everyday tasks around the house. I applied light makeup, styled my hair, and even added small pearl earrings that had been a gift from Richard on our last anniversary before his death. In the kitchen, I made coffee but didn't prepare breakfast. Instead, I took my mug to the back patio and sat watching the garden come alive with morning light. The rose bushes I had planted and tended for years glowed with dew, their petals unfurling slowly in the warming air. A pair of cardinals flitted between branches of the maple tree, vibrant against the green leaves. This quiet moment belonged to me alone. Not service, not obligation, just existence. I heard movement inside the house around 8:30. The shower running upstairs, cabinet doors opening and closing, the familiar sounds of the household stirring to life. Still, I didn't move. I sipped my coffee and waited. James appeared first, shuffling into the kitchen in search of caffeine. From my position on the patio, I could see him through the glass doors, looking confused at the absence of the usual breakfast spread. He poured himself coffee from the pot I had made, glanced around, then spotted me outside. He slid the patio door open, coffee in hand. "Morning, Mom. Everything okay?" "Good morning," I replied, smiling. "Everything's fine. Just enjoying the garden." He nodded, rubbed at his stubble jaw. "Great party last night." "Seemed to be. The food looked wonderful." "You didn't join us?" He observed, though there was no accusation in his tone. "No," I said, simply, offering no explanation. He shifted his weight, clearly unused to this version of me. The one who didn't immediately rise to prepare his meal, who sat enjoying leisure while he served himself. "I'm starving," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Think there's any of that sourdough left?" "Probably," I replied. "Check the bread box." His eyebrows lifted slightly at my response. No offer to make his toast, no immediate movement toward the kitchen, but he just nodded. "Right, thanks." He disappeared back inside, and I returned my gaze to the garden. A small interaction, but significant. For the first time in years, I had not jumped to fulfill a need he was perfectly capable of meeting himself. Meredith emerged nearly an hour later, impeccably put together, despite the early hour and the previous night's festivities. She swept into the kitchen in yoga clothes, her hair pulled back in a sleek ponytail face, glowing with whatever expensive skincare regime she followed. By then I had moved inside and was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, still making no move to prepare food for anyone. "Good morning, Catherine." She said, her tone bright, but eyes slightly narrowed as she took in my attire and position. "You're dressed up. Just felt like wearing something nice today," I replied. "There's coffee if you'd like some." "Thanks." She poured herself a cup, added almond milk, then leaned against the counter. "Last night went well. Don't you think everyone loved the food?" "I'm sure they did." The caterer seemed very professional. She nodded, her eyes darting around the kitchen. "I thought we might have some pastries left," she said finally. "I haven't checked." I responded, turning a page in my newspaper. A brief silence followed, the kind that forms when an established pattern suddenly breaks. For years, I had been the one to clean up after parties, to organize leftovers, to ensure breakfast was ready the next morning, regardless of how late the evening had run. Now I sat reading about international politics, while Meredith tried to process this subtle but significant change. "Well," she said finally, "I might run to that bakery on 5th. They have those amazing croissants." Would you like anything?" I looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "No, thank you. I've eaten." Another beat of silence. She shifted her weight, clearly uncomfortable. "All right then, I'll just go grab my purse." She disappeared upstairs and I returned to my newspaper, aware that I had just made a small but decisive alteration to the household dynamics. Not confrontational, not disruptive, simply different. A quiet reassertion of autonomy. When she returned, car keys in hand, she paused in the kitchen doorway. "Oh, Catherine, before I forget, some of my work friends are coming over tomorrow afternoon. Just a casual thing. Would you mind making that spinach dip everyone loves?" In the past, I would have immediately agreed, pleased to be useful, to be included even peripherally in her social plans. But the woman who had stayed up reading her old case notes, who had remembered arguing before the state Supreme Court, looked up calmly and said, "I'm afraid I have plans tomorrow afternoon." Meredith blinked. "Oh, what plans?" The question itself revealed how rarely I had claimed time for myself. How unexpected it was for me to have an agenda separate from household service. I smiled slightly, folded my newspaper, and stood up. "Just personal matters I need to attend to," I said, not elaborating. "I'm sure the store-bought dip will be fine. The one in the black container is nearly identical to my recipe." I walked past her, leaving her standing in the kitchen with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not exactly confusion, but the particular look of someone whose convenient assumption had just been gently but firmly corrected. I spent the rest of the day quietly reclaiming small pieces of myself. I wrote emails to 2 former colleagues I had lost touch with, asking about their lives, mentioning that I was considering reconnecting with the legal community in some capacity. I organized my closet, moving the better quality clothing items to the front, packing away the shapeless cardigans and faded slacks I had adopted as my uniform of invisibility. I made a doctor's appointment I had been postponing, called a friend I hadn't spoken to in months, and researched community education programs at the local university. Small steps, nothing dramatic, but each one a thread reconnecting me to the wider world beyond this house and its limiting perceptions. That evening, when James asked what was for dinner, I smiled and handed him a takeout menu from the Italian restaurant around the corner. "I thought we might order in tonight," I said. "My treat." He looked surprised but didn't protest. Meredith, who had been unusually quiet since returning from the bakery, merely nodded and said she'd have the arugula salad with chicken. We ate in the dining room, a space usually reserved for Meredith's gatherings, using the everyday plates rather than the fine china. The conversation was minimal, but not tense, a family adjusting to a subtle shift in gravity, testing new positions. When James asked about my plans for the following day, clearly having been informed by Meredith, I answered truthfully. "I'm meeting with my financial advisor, and then I thought I might visit the art museum. They have an exhibition on women artists I've been wanting to see. I didn't know you had a financial advisor," he said, fork pausing halfway to his mouth. "I've had one for years," I replied. "The same firm that managed my investments when I was practicing law. They've done quite well for me." Meredith's head snapped up. "Practicing law!" I met her gaze steadily. Yes, I was an attorney for 27 years before I retired. I specialized in employment discrimination and environmental law. The silence that followed was profound. James stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Meredith's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning realization that made the color rise to her cheeks. I didn't know that. she said finally, her voice unusually small. No, I agreed, taking a sip of water. You didn't. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. I didn't pull out my credentials or list my accomplishments. I simply stated a fact and let it hang in the air between us, a quiet correction to years of misperception. James cleared his throat. Mom, why didn't you ever talk about this? I considered his question carefully. No one ever asked, I said finally. And after a while, it seemed easier to be what you needed me to be, someone who helped around the house, who didn't complicate your lives with her own history or identity. That's not... He began but stopped, perhaps realizing that denying it wouldn't make it less true. It's fine, I said gently. We all made assumptions. I allowed mine to be made about me. But I think it's time for some changes. What kind of changes? Meredith asked, her voice cautious. I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. Nothing dramatic. I'm just going to start living more fully as myself again. Taking up space in ways I've avoided for a while. The rest of the meal passed in awkward silence, each of us processing this shift from our own perspective. I didn't push further. I had planted the seed, the awareness that I was more than they had allowed themselves to see. That was enough for one evening. Later in my room, I opened the wooden box again and removed a business card I had kept all these years. Margaret Chen, my closest colleague from the law firm, now a senior partner. We had lost touch after I moved in with James and Meredith, my fault more than hers. I had stopped returning calls, stopped accepting lunch invitations, gradually cutting ties with my professional past as I settled into my role as the helpful mother-in-law. I stared at the card for a long moment, then reached for my phone and composed a text message. Maggie, it's Catherine Mitchell. It's been too long. I'd love to catch up if you have time for coffee this week. The response came faster than I expected. Catherine, what a wonderful surprise. How about Thursday at 11? The cafe near your old office still makes that lemon cake you loved, she remembered. After all this time, she remembered something as small as my preference for lemon cake. The realization brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Tears not of sadness, but of recognition, of being known. Thursday is perfect, I replied, looking forward to it. I placed my phone on the nightstand and lay back on my bed, staring at the ceiling. The day had been quiet, unmarked by confrontation or drama, yet I felt as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. I had begun to reclaim my voice, not loudly, not with anger, but with the steady confidence that had once defined my professional life. Tomorrow I would meet with my financial advisor. I would visit the museum. I would continue taking small steps back toward the woman I had been before I became invisible. And when Meredith's friends came over for their casual gathering, I would be elsewhere, not hiding in my room, not serving in the background, but living my own life in the foreground. The distinction felt monumental. Thursday morning arrived with a gentle rain that beaded on windows and softened the edges of the world outside. I dressed with particular care, a tailored navy pantsuit I hadn't worn in years, a cream silk blouse, low heels, and the pearl necklace Richard had given me on our 25th anniversary. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized myself, not because the clothes transformed me, but because the posture did back straight, shoulders squared, chin lifted. The stance of a woman who expected to be seen. James had already left for work, but Meredith was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, tapping at her laptop with a coffee mug at her elbow. She looked up as I entered, her eyes widening slightly at my appearance. You look nice, she said, clearly surprised. Special occasion. Meeting an old colleague for coffee. I replied, pouring myself a cup. Maggie Chen. We worked together for over 20 years. Meredith nodded her fingers, stilling on the keyboard. In the 5 days since our dinner conversation, she had been uncharacteristically subdued around me. Not hostile, not exactly apologetic, but watchful, as if re-evaluating something she had previously taken for granted, the lawyer. She said the word sounding strange in her mouth, like she was trying it on, testing how it fit with her image of me. Yes, I said simply. She's a senior partner now. Another nod, another moment of recalibration. Will you be home for dinner? I thought I might try that new pasta recipe. The question held a different weight than it would have a week ago. No longer an assumption of my availability, but a genuine inquiry into my plans. A small shift, but meaningful. I should be, I said. The appointment shouldn't take more than an hour or so. Good. She replied, then hesitated before adding, I'd like to hear about your friend. If you want to share, I mean. I studied her face, searching for the familiar signs of polite dismissal, but found only an uncertain sincerity. I'd like that, I said, finally surprising us both. I left shortly after driving myself to the cafe, where Maggie and I had shared countless lunches in our working days. The rain had tapered to a fine mist, wrapping the city in a soft gray embrace that made the cafe's warm lighting seem especially inviting as I approached. Maggie was already there, seated at a corner table with 2 coffees and a plate of lemon cake waiting. She stood as I entered, her face breaking into a wide smile. At 65, she was a formidable presence, silver-streaked black hair, cut in a sharp bob, impeccable charcoal suit, and the confident bearing of someone comfortable with authority. Catherine Mitchell, she said, embracing me warmly. It's about damn time. I laughed, returning her embrace before settling into the chair across from her. I know. I've been preoccupied. 5 years of preoccupied, she noted, pushing a coffee toward me. That's quite the distraction. There was no judgment in her tone, only friendly observation. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and took a deep breath. I disappeared into someone else's life, I said finally. It wasn't intentional, but somewhere along the way I stopped being Catherine Mitchell, attorney at law, and became just Mom. Just the helpful mother-in-law who stays out of the way. Maggie studied me over the rim of her coffee cup. And now I'm remembering there was more to me than that there still is. She nodded, satisfaction gleaming in her dark eyes. Good. Because the Catherine I knew was a force to be reckoned with. I've missed her. I've missed her too. I admitted. More than I realized until recently. So tell me, Maggie said, cutting into the lemon cake and sliding a piece toward me. What brought on this awakening? I told her about the party, about overhearing Meredith casually dismissing me as uneducated, about the shock of realizing how thoroughly I had allowed myself to be misperceived. I told her about the box of memories, about the quiet changes I had been making, about the subtle shift in household dynamics. Maggie listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and regarded me steadily. You know what this reminds me of? She said finally. The Ramirez case. I blinked, surprised by the reference to one of the first major cases we had worked on together, nearly 30 years earlier. How so? Remember how she kept minimizing what was happening to her? How she'd convinced herself she was overreacting, being too sensitive, making a fuss about nothing. Maggie leaned forward, her eyes intent. And remember what you told her. I did remember. The words had been seared into my memory from the moment I spoke them. I told her that sometimes the most insidious form of power is convincing someone they don't deserve to take up space, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they're allowed to keep. Exactly. Maggie pointed her fork at me for emphasis. You were fierce about it, Catherine. You wouldn't let her believe she deserved less than full respect, full recognition. And now, here you are having allowed exactly that dynamic to play out in your own life. The observation stung, but I couldn't deny its accuracy. It happened so gradually, I said softly. And they're not bad people, Maggie. My son loves me. Meredith is complicated, but she's not deliberately cruel. Of course not, Maggie agreed. The most effective erasures rarely involve deliberate cruelty. They're made of small assumptions, unexamined privileges, and the convenient fiction that certain people, often women past a certain age, exist primarily to facilitate other people's lives. She cut another piece of cake, her movements precise. So what now? You've remembered who you are. What are you going to do about it? It was the question I had been asking myself all week. What did I want? Not revenge, not dramatic confrontation. Just recognition. Respect. The space to be fully myself again. I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. But I know I can't go back to invisibility. I've started with small things reclaiming my time, my interests, speaking more directly about my past. I'm considering volunteering with the Legal Aid Society again. Maggie's eyes lit up. They would be thrilled to have you. Reynolds just retired last month and they're desperately short on experienced advisors. I'd need to update my knowledge, I said, already feeling a flutter of excitement at the prospect. A lot has changed in 5 years. Not as much as you might think, Maggie replied. And what has changed you can learn. You were always the quickest study in the firm. We spent the next hour reminiscing about old cases, catching up on colleagues' lives, and discussing possibilities for my re-entry into the legal world, even in a limited capacity. By the time we parted, promising not to let another 5 years pass, before our next meeting, I felt more like myself than I had in ages, engaged, intellectually stimulated, connected to a part of my identity that had been dormant, but never truly gone. As I drove home, I considered Maggie's comparison to the Ramirez case. She was right. I had passionately defended other women's right to respect and recognition, while gradually surrendering my own. The irony wasn't lost on me, but recognizing the pattern was the first step toward changing it. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. Meredith's car wasn't in the driveway, and no lights shone from the windows, despite the gray afternoon. I let myself in, removed my coat, and moved through the familiar spaces with new eyes, seeing not just a house where I helped and served, but a house my money had purchased, my taste had influenced, my labor had maintained. A house that had been mine before it became theirs. I made tea and carried it to the living room, sitting not in my usual inconspicuous corner of the sofa, but in the comfortable armchair usually reserved for guests. From a drawer in the side table, I retrieved a notepad and pen and began to write. Not a manifesto, not an accusation, just a clear accounting of facts that had been conveniently forgotten or overlooked. The deed to the house, solely in my name. My monthly contributions to household expenses for the past 5 years. The market rate for the living space they occupied. The approximate value of the household services I provided. It wasn't meant to be punitive, It was simply a reminder to them and to myself that relationships built on unacknowledged imbalances couldn't thrive. That generosity freely given should still be recognized as generosity, not taken as an entitlement. I didn't intend to present this accounting immediately. The time wasn't right yet. But having it prepared gave me a sense of clarity of boundaries reestablished. It reminded me that I had options, resources, agency. That I wasn't trapped or dependent. I had chosen this arrangement and could unchoose it if necessary. The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted my thoughts. Moments later, the front door opened, and Meredith entered, arms full of grocery bags. She paused when she saw me sitting in the living room, still in my business attire, notepad in hand. "Oh," she said, sounding slightly breathless. "You're home." I set the notepad aside and stood. "Just got back. Need help with those bags?" "If you don't mind," she replied, sounding relieved. I followed her to the kitchen, taking some of the bags from her arms and placing them on the counter. She began unpacking groceries with efficient movements, arranging items in their designated places. "How was your coffee?" she asked after a moment, her tone casual but attentive. "Wonderful," I replied honestly. It was good to reconnect with Maggie. She's invited me to consider volunteering with the Legal Aid Society again. Meredith's hand stilled on a bundle of asparagus. "Would you want to do that? Get back into law?" "In a limited capacity, yes. I was quite good at it, you know." She flushed slightly, no doubt remembering her dismissive comments at the party. "I'm sure you were," she said, turning to place the vegetables in the refrigerator. "Will it be time-consuming?" The question revealed her concern, not about my fulfillment or interests, but about how my changing identity might impact the household routine she had come to rely on. "It would be part-time," I said. "But yes, it would require some adjustment to our current arrangements." She nodded, seemingly absorbing this. After a moment, she asked, "What kind of law did you practice?" "Exactly, I mean." It was the first time in 5 years she had expressed genuine interest in my professional past. I leaned against the counter and watched her unpack the remaining groceries. I specialized in employment discrimination, particularly gender and age-based cases, I said. I also worked on environmental justice issues representing communities affected by corporate pollution. "That sounds important." She said the word clearly insufficient but sincere. "It was," I agreed. "I helped a lot of people who didn't have the power or resources to fight for themselves." Another nod, another adjustment to her mental image of me. "Did you always want to be a lawyer?" And just like that, we were having our first real conversation, not about household matters or social obligations, but about me as a person with a history and identity separate from my role in her life. I told her about my early ambitions about attending law school as one of only 12 women in my class, about meeting Richard during my second year and his unwavering support of my career. As we prepared dinner together, a collaborative effort rather than my sole responsibility, the conversation continued tentative but genuine. She asked questions. I answered. Simple but revolutionary in the context of our previous relationship. When James came home, he found us in the kitchen, wine glasses in hand, dinner simmering on the stove, engaged in conversation about a case I had worked on involving a textile factory with unsafe working conditions. "What's all this?" he asked, looking pleased but confused by the unexpected scene. "Your mother was just telling me about her work with the textile workers. Class action," Meredith said, her tone almost reverent. "Did you know she got them a settlement that provided lifetime medical monitoring for everyone exposed to the chemicals James looked at me with new eyes, seeing not just his mother, but a woman with accomplishments he had never acknowledged. "I remember you working late on that case," he said slowly. "I must have been about 12. Dad used to make us dinner on those nights. He was always supportive," I replied. He understood what the work meant to me. "I wish I'd paid more attention." James said, a note of regret in his voice. I smiled at him, feeling neither accusation nor resentment, just a quiet satisfaction that he was finally seeing a more complete version of me. "It's never too late to start," I said. That evening we ate dinner at the table rather than in front of the television. We really talked about our lives, our interests, our histories. Meredith shared stories about her early days in marketing that I'd never heard before. James reminisced about college experiences I hadn't known about. And I spoke about my career with the confidence of someone who knew her value, who didn't need to minimize her achievements to make others comfortable. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Years of patterns couldn't be undone in a single evening. But it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of assumptions and unexamined habits that had defined our relationship for too long. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. I looked different somehow. Not physically changed, but more present, more solid. The woman looking back at me was neither a faded background figure nor the fiery young attorney I had once been. She was something new and yet familiar, a synthesis of all my experiences, all my roles, all my strengths. She was neither silent nor loud, neither invisible nor demanding, but simply and completely herself. And for the first time in a very long time, I was glad to meet her. In the weeks that followed, the household settled into a new rhythm, not entirely comfortable yet, but more honest, more balanced. I began volunteering at the Legal Aid Society 2 mornings a week, offering guidance to younger attorneys on discrimination cases. The work energized me, reconnecting me to skills and knowledge I had feared might have atrophied beyond recovery. But they hadn't. They had merely been dormant, waiting for the right conditions to flourish again. At home, small changes accumulated. I still cooked most evenings, but by choice rather than expectation, and often with James or Meredith helping. I attended some of their social gatherings, but excused myself from others, no longer feeling obligated to be either server or wallpaper. I spoke more directly about my opinions, my preferences, my past. Meredith watched me with careful attention during this transformation, her behavior toward me shifting in subtle but significant ways. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something closer to respect, even deference at times. She began asking my opinion on work matters, particularly when they involved potential legal issues. She introduced me to her friends not as James's mother, but as Catherine, the former attorney, who now advises at Legal Aid. It was progress, imperfect but meaningful. One evening in late May, about a month after the party that had catalyzed these changes, Meredith approached me as I sat reading on the patio. The spring evening was mild, the garden in full bloom around us. She carried 2 glasses of wine and offered one to me before taking the chair across from mine. "I owe you an apology," she said without preamble, her eyes direct, though clearly uncomfortable. I accepted the wine but didn't immediately respond, waiting for her to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about how I've treated you these past years." She went on, her fingers tracing the stem of her glass. "How I spoke about you to others. How I assumed things about your life, your education, your capabilities. She took a breath, squared her shoulders slightly. It was disrespectful, and I am deeply sorry. The apology was clearly difficult for her, a woman accustomed to being right to controlling narratives, to defining the social hierarchies in her sphere. But it was also clearly sincere. Thank you, I said simply. I appreciate that. I'd like to understand why I did it. She continued surprising me with her self-reflection. I think there was something comforting about believing you were simple, uncomplicated. It made it easier to accept your help without feeling, I don't know, inadequate by comparison, or guilty about how much we relied on you. I considered her words carefully. Perhaps it's also easier to accept someone's service if you believe they're naturally suited to it, that they couldn't do more if given the chance. She winced slightly but nodded. That's painfully accurate. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our wine, watching the last light fade from the garden. Finally, she spoke again. I'd like us to start over if that's possible. Not completely. I know I can't undo 5 years of whatever this has been. But I'd like to know you, Catherine, the real you, if you're willing to let me. The request was unexpected but not unwelcome. I studied her face, the genuine contrition in her eyes, the hopeful set of her mouth. Meredith was not an easy woman. She was ambitious sometimes, self-centered, often focused on appearances. But she was also intelligent, capable, and when she chose to be deeply loyal to those she respected. And she was trying. That mattered. I think I'd like that, I said finally. She smiled, relief evident in the softening of her shoulders. Good. That's good. Another silence, more comfortable this time. There's something else, she said after a while, her voice slightly hesitant. James and I have been talking about our living situation. I felt a flicker of apprehension. Was this the moment when they would suggest I find my own place? Now that I was reclaiming my independence, was I no longer welcome in their daily lives? We've been looking at houses, she continued, in Oak Hill. Oak Hill was an upscale neighborhood about 20 minutes away. Newer homes, larger lots closer to their offices. I see, I said carefully, keeping my expression neutral. We think it's time we had our own place, she said. We've been saving, and with the promotion James is up for. She trailed off, then added quickly, Of course this is your home. We would never expect you to leave, but we think it might be better for everyone if we had our own space. The relief I felt was immediate and surprising in its intensity. Not because I wanted them gone, but because the decision felt right, a natural evolution of our changing relationship rather than a rejection or retreat. I think that's a wise decision, I said honestly. For all of us. She nodded clearly, relieved by my response. We've found a place we really like. 4 bedrooms, so plenty of room when you want to visit. Or stay for a while. The addition was careful, deliberate, an acknowledgement that I would always have a place in their lives, even as they established a separate household. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. We talked then about their house hunting, about the neighborhoods they'd considered, about their timeline for moving. It was the most natural conversation we'd ever had, no power dynamics, no hidden resentments. Just 2 adults sharing plans and possibilities. When James joined us later, bringing a plate of cheese and crackers and his own glass of wine, the conversation continued in the same vein, relaxed, respectful, genuine. For the first time, I felt like we were truly family, rather than reluctant cohabitants connected by choice and affection, rather than obligation and assumption. As they talked about their plans for the new house, I found myself thinking about what their departure would mean for me. Not a loss, as I might once have feared, but an opportunity. A chance to reclaim not just my identity, but my space, my routines, my full independence. I could repaint the walls, colors Meredith had deemed too bold. I could rearrange the furniture to suit my preferences rather than her aesthetic. I could host my own gatherings, former colleagues, new friends from the Legal Aid Society, neighbors I had been meaning to know better. I could live fully as myself again, not just professionally, but personally. And strangely paradoxically, doing so might actually strengthen my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law, rather than damaging it. Because when we are seen fully respected completely, we can connect more authentically than when we're reduced to the roles others need us to play. Later that night, I opened the wooden box again, not with the ache of loss that had accompanied my first rediscovery, but with a sense of continuity and possibility. These achievements weren't just my past. They were the foundation for my present and future. They were proof of a capacity that hadn't diminished with age only, with opportunity. Among the papers, I found a letter I had forgotten, a thank you note from a young woman I had mentored early in her career. "You showed me it was possible," she had written. Not just to succeed, but to remain fully human while doing so. I traced the words with my fingertip, feeling their truth resonate through the years. That was what I wanted now. Not just success or recognition, but the space to be fully human in all my complexity. Not just someone's mother or someone's mother-in-law, but Catherine Mitchell in her entirety, with skills and flaws, wisdom and blind spots, strengths and vulnerabilities. And for the first time in years, I believed it was possible. Not because James and Meredith were moving out, though that would help, but because I had finally remembered how to take up space without apology, how to speak truth without aggression, how to be present without permission. The most profound change wasn't in how they saw me, but in how I saw myself. 2 months later, I stood in the empty dining room, watching as movers carried the last of James and Meredith's furniture to the waiting truck. Sunlight streamed through windows, no longer draped with the heavy curtains Meredith had preferred, illuminating walls that would soon be painted the warm terracotta I had always envisioned. "I think that's everything," James said, coming to stand beside me. "Except for the patio furniture. Meredith says you should keep it. It works better in this garden anyway." I nodded, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Not sadness exactly, but a gentle nostalgia mixed with anticipation. "The house feels bigger already," he laughed softly. "It was always big. We just filled it with too much stuff." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the movers navigate the hallway with a bookshelf. "Are you sure you'll be okay here alone?" he asked, not for the first time. "There's still room for you at our place. A whole suite on the ground floor. You'd have plenty of privacy." "I know," I said, patting his arm. "And I appreciate the offer. But I think we all need our own space now. I'll visit often, I promise." He nodded understanding. In the weeks since they had found their new house, our relationship had continued its careful reconstruction. He asked more questions about my past, listened more attentively to my opinions, saw me more completely as a person separate from my role as his mother. It wasn't perfect. Old habits emerged occasionally. Old assumptions reasserted themselves, but the trajectory was positive. "Besides," I added with a smile, "I'm hardly going to be sitting around alone. I've doubled my hours at Legal Aid, joined that book club at the library, and Maggie's trying to convince me to help with a fundraiser for the women's shelter next month." "You're busier than I am," he said, returning my smile. "Just promise you'll call if you need anything. Anything at all." "I will," I assured him, knowing I probably wouldn't need to. The capacity for independence doesn't disappear with age. It simply needs regular exercise to remain strong. Meredith appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, rather than her usual polished attire. Moving day had stripped away some of her carefully maintained facade, revealing a more approachable version of herself. "The truck's almost loaded," she announced. "We should be ready to leave in about 20 minutes. "Perfect timing," I said. "The painting crew arrives tomorrow. By next week, the place will look completely different." She surveyed the room with a thoughtful expression. "I can't quite picture it with terracotta walls, but I bet it will be beautiful. It will be different," I acknowledged. "But that's the point. This house has always reflected someone else's vision first, the previous owners, then yours. Now it's my turn." She nodded, understanding the deeper meaning beneath my words. "You have excellent taste, Catherine. I'm sorry I didn't appreciate that sooner." It was as close to another apology as she was likely to offer, and I accepted it with a smile. "You're always welcome here, you know. Both of you. This will always be a place where you belong. And you'll always have a place with us," she replied. "A real place, not—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Not a servant's quarters," I suggested gently without rancor. She winced but nodded. "Not that. Never again." The movers called from outside, signaling they were ready for final instructions. James and Meredith went to join them, leaving me alone in the sun-filled room for a moment. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the house, the familiar creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the tap of tree branches against the kitchen window. This had been my home before they came, and it would be my home after they left. But somehow it felt new again, a space of possibility rather than confinement. Outside car doors slammed, engines started. I moved to the front porch to wave goodbye as they pulled away James in his car, Meredith following in hers, the moving truck bringing up the rear. They honked and waved their faces, a mixture of excitement for what lay ahead and affection for what they were leaving behind. I stood watching until they turned the corner and disappeared from view. Then I went back inside, closing the door softly behind me. The house was quiet but not empty. It was filled with sunlight, with potential, with a future I was finally ready to claim. I walked through each room slowly, mentally rearranging furniture, choosing paint colors, reimagining spaces. In the kitchen, I made a cup of tea and carried it to the patio, settling into one of the chairs Meredith had insisted I keep. The garden was in full summer bloom. Roses climbing trellises, hydrangeas, heavy with blue blossoms, herbs sending up fragrant stems in terracotta pots. I had planted most of them myself over the years, tending them with the quiet patience of someone accustomed to nurturing growth without commanding attention. They had flourished anyway, becoming more vibrant, more established with each passing season, much like me. I sipped my tea and considered what lay ahead. Tomorrow, painters would arrive to transform the walls. Next week, I would host a small dinner for colleagues from the Legal Aid Society. The week after, I had tickets to a chamber music concert I'd been wanting to attend for years. Small plans, ordinary moments, but entirely mine-chosen with intention, rather than accepted by default. My phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Made it to the new house. Everything's chaos, but we'll sort it out. Dinner next Sunday." I smiled and typed back, "Looking forward to it. Bring a bottle of that Syrah we like." Another buzz, this time from Meredith. "The kitchen is a disaster. Wish you were here to help organize, but also glad you're claiming your space. Send pictures of the painting, progress. Progress indeed. Not just in the house, but in all of us. I set the phone aside and returned to my tea, watching a hummingbird hover near the lavender bush. The late afternoon light was golden warm, illuminating every leaf and petal with extraordinary clarity. I had always loved this time of day, the gentle transition from afternoon to evening, when the world seems to pause briefly, holding its breath before moving forward. In the quiet of my reclaimed solitude, I felt no emptiness, no loss, only the profound satisfaction of having remembered who I was, of having spoken my truth. Not with bitterness or blame, but with the steady confidence of a woman who knew her worth. Sometimes the loudest thing a woman can do is simply refuse to be silent. Not shouting, not demanding, just calmly, firmly insisting on her right to be fully present, fully acknowledged, fully herself. I had done that finally. And in doing so, I had not only reclaimed my voice, but transformed the very conversations around me. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the garden in deepening gold. Tomorrow would bring change, and the day after that, and the one after that. But now, in this moment, I sat perfectly still, perfectly at peace, perfectly at home in myself once more. And that I realized was the truest homecoming of all. 3 months after James and Meredith moved into their new home, I found myself standing before the polished oak doors of the county courthouse. My reflection in the glass showed a woman I was still getting reacquainted with, hair styled in a sleek silver bob, rather than the shapeless cut I'd worn for years, posture, straight eyes, clear and focused. I wore a charcoal pantsuit that had been buried in the back of my closet for half a decade now, tailored to fit my current frame. "Ready for this?" Maggie asked, appearing beside me with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. I took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. The courthouse hadn't changed much in the years since I'd last walked its halls. The same marble floors, the same hushed reverence, the same scent of furniture polish and paper and coffee. What had changed was me returning not as the powerhouse attorney I once was, but as something different, a mentor, an advisor, a woman reclaiming her expertise after years of voluntary silence. Today marked my first appearance as a formal advisor on a housing discrimination case that the Legal Aid Society had been building for months. A group of elderly tenants facing eviction from a building being converted to luxury condominiums. People being displaced not because they couldn't pay their rent, but because they no longer fit the profitable demographic their landlord wanted to attract. People who, like me, had been deemed inconvenient, forgettable, background characters in someone else's story of success. As we made our way through security and toward the assigned courtroom, I felt a familiar tension building in my stomach. Not fear exactly, but the heightened awareness that came before any legal proceeding. The mental sharpening, the increased focus, the subtle shift from ordinary participant in the world to observer and strategist. Catherine. I turned to see Sarah Chen, Maggie's niece, and the young attorney heading the case, hurrying toward us. At 32, she radiated the kind of intense energy I remembered from my early career. Eager, determined, slightly terrified, beneath a veneer of confidence. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, gripping my hand. "I've incorporated all your suggestions into the brief, and the witness preparation sessions yesterday went exactly as you predicted." I smiled, squeezing her hand in return. "You've done the hard work, Sarah. I'm just here to observe and advise if needed. Don't let her modesty fool you," Maggie told her niece. Catherine was the best cross-examiner in the firm. She could make hostile witnesses admit things they didn't even know they knew. I laughed softly. That was a long time ago. Some skills never fade. Maggie replied with a knowing look. We entered the courtroom, finding it already half filled, with the elderly tenants, men and women in their 70s and 80s. Some with canes or walkers, all with the wary, dignified expressions of people who had lived long enough to recognize injustice, but still retained enough hope to fight it. As we settled into our seats at the plaintiff's table, I felt eyes on me, curious gazes from both the tenants and the opposing counsel. I was new to them, an unknown quantity, inserted into a case that had been developing for months. I met their looks with calm acknowledgement, neither asserting nor retreating. The opposing counsel, a sleek team from a downtown firm I recognized as one of the city's most aggressive real estate practices, huddled at their table, occasionally glancing our way. The lead attorney, a man about James's age with expertly tailored clothing and a perpetual frown, leaned over to whisper something to his associate while looking directly at me. "That's Victor Harmon," Maggie murmured. "Built his entire career helping developers find loopholes to evict people like our clients. Rumor has it his firm gets a percentage of the increased property value after conversion." I nodded, studying him with professional detachment. I remember his father, Robert Harmon, represented that chemical company in the watershed contamination case back in '94. "Like father, like son," Maggie replied dryly. Sarah spread her notes before her, highlighting key points with quick, nervous movements. I placed a hand lightly on her arm. "Remember," I said quietly, "this isn't about real estate law. This is about human beings. Make the judge see the people, not just the property." She nodded, taking a deep breath. "That's exactly what you said in that discrimination case against Meridian Textiles. I looked it up in the archives." I blinked, surprised. "You researched my old cases?" "Of course," she replied as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "When Aunt Maggie said you were joining us, I pulled everything I could find. Your approach to the Meridian case changed how employee rights cases were argued in this state." Before I could respond, the court officer called for attention, and we rose as Judge Martinez entered. The proceedings began with the familiar rhythm of legal formalities, case numbers recited, appearances entered, preliminary motions addressed. I watched Sarah carefully as she presented our opening arguments. Her nervousness had vanished, replaced by the focused intensity of a young attorney who knew her case intimately and believed in its merits. She spoke clearly, passionately about the systematic attempt to remove long-term elderly residents who had built communities within those walls, who had nowhere else to go, who couldn't afford the skyrocketing rents elsewhere in the city. "This is not simply about property rights," she concluded, echoing my advice. "This is about whether we allow profit to trump humanity, whether we permit age and income to determine who deserves stability and dignity." Victor Harmon's opening was equally polished, but coldly practical, focusing on property values, development, rights, market economics. The invisible hand that supposedly benefited everyone, while actually pushing the vulnerable aside. I had heard these arguments before decades ago, and in countless variations since. The language of inevitability, used to disguise the deliberate choices that prioritized certain lives over others. As the first witness was called Eleanor Patterson, an 83-year-old former librarian who had lived in her apartment for 37 years. I leaned forward slightly. This testimony would set the tone for the entire proceeding. Eleanor moved slowly to the stand, supporting herself with a carved wooden cane. Once seated, however, her posture straightened, and her voice emerged clear and steady as she was sworn in. Sarah led her gently through her history. In the building, her community connections, her fixed income, the impossibility of finding comparable housing she could afford. Eleanor spoke with dignity rather than self-pity, with clarity rather than confusion. She was everything we could have hoped for in a lead witness. Then Victor Harmon stood for cross-examination, adjusting his tie with manicured fingers. "Mrs. Patterson," he began smoothly, "isn't it true that your lease explicitly states that terms may change upon renewal?" "It does say that, yes," she replied. "And isn't it true that you were offered relocation assistance by the building owners?" "They offered $500, Eleanor said flatly. "Have you tried to rent an apartment recently? Mr. Harmon, $500 barely covers application fees these days." I suppressed a smile. Eleanor wasn't going to be an easy target. Harmon continued his attempt to portray the management company as reasonable, the evictions as unfortunate, but legitimate business decisions from the tenants as people clinging to arrangements that no longer made economic sense. When he finished, Sarah stood for redirect, but before she could speak, Eleanor addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, may I say something?" Judge Martinez nodded. "Briefly, Mrs. Patterson." Eleanor's gaze swept the courtroom before settling back on the judge. "I've lived in that apartment since my husband died in 1985. I know every crack in the ceiling, every creak in the floor. The Super's children call me Grandma Ellie. I water my neighbor's plants when he visits his daughter in Phoenix. I can tell you which floor needs maintenance by the sound the elevator makes when it stops there." She paused, her hand steady on her cane. "They keep saying the building needs to be better utilized, as if human beings living their lives creating a community, caring for each other, that's not a proper utilization of space, as if we become less valuable as we age." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Victor Harmon had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I don't expect charity," Eleanor continued. "I've paid my rent on time for 37 years. I've been a good tenant. I just want to be seen as a person, not a problem to be removed." I felt something tighten in my chest. Recognition, empathy, a profound understanding of what it meant to be reduced to an inconvenience, to be rendered invisible by those who found your existence incompatible with their vision. Judge Martinez thanked Eleanor, and she returned to her seat, dignified and composed. As the next witness was called, Maggie leaned toward me. "She's amazing," she whispered. "Yes," I agreed. "And genuine. That's what will win this case, not just the legal arguments, but the humanity behind them." The day proceeded with more testimony, other tenants, a housing expert, the building superintendent who visibly struggled with divided loyalties. By late afternoon, when the judge called a recess until the following morning, I could feel the momentum building in our favor. Not certainty yet, but possibility. As we gathered our materials, Victor Harmon approached our table. His expression was a practiced blend of professionalism and condescension. "Ms. Chenta," he said to Sarah, "perhaps we should discuss settlement options before this drags on unnecessarily." Sarah glanced at me, then back to Harmon. "I'd be happy to hear what your clients are offering. Increased relocation assistance, 3 months rent equivalent instead of 1, and priority application status for the new units once renovation is complete, though obviously at market rates, which would be 3 times what they're currently paying," Sarah noted. "Hardly a solution." Harmon shrugged all calculated reasonableness. Development is inevitable, Ms. Chen. Your clients are simply delaying the inevitable while incurring legal costs they can ill afford. I'd maintained my silence, observing the interaction from slightly behind Sarah. But something in his tone, the casual dismissal, the assumption that economic advancement mattered more than human dignity, sparked a response. "Mr. Harmon," I said, stepping forward. "I believe what Ms. Chen is suggesting is that your clients consider a more substantive approach, perhaps long-term leases with controlled increases for existing tenants, with renovations phased to minimize displacement." He looked at me properly for the first time, eyes narrowing slightly. "And you are Catherine Mitchell. I'm consulting on this case." Recognition flickered across his face, followed quickly by reassessment. "Mitchell. From the Westlake pollution case. And that discrimination suit against Meridian Textile. Among others," I replied evenly. His posture shifted subtly, not quite defensive but more alert. "Those were quite some time ago. Legal principles don't expire, Mr. Harmon. Neither does basic humanity." He studied me for another moment, then nodded curtly. "I'll convey your suggestion to my clients, but I wouldn't get those tenants' hopes up." He turned and walked away, back straight, shoulders rigid. Sarah let out a breath. "That was... wow. He actually seemed rattled." "Not rattled," I corrected. "Recalculating. He thought he was facing an inexperienced attorney and a group of defenseless elderly tenants. Now he knows he's dealing with something more substantial." "Do you think they'll consider an actual settlement?" Sarah asked. "Perhaps. But more importantly, he'll prepare more carefully for tomorrow, which means we need to do the same." I turned to her with a smile. "I hope you didn't have dinner plans." We worked late into the evening in the Legal Aid Society's modest conference room, refining arguments, anticipating counterpoints, practicing cross-examination techniques. Sarah was a quick study, absorbing suggestions and adapting them to her own style, rather than simply imitating mine. Around 9, as we were reviewing the financial disclosure documents from the development company, my phone buzzed with a text from James. "How did the first day go? Still getting used to the idea of my mom in court again. Proud of you." The simple message warmed me unexpectedly. I texted back. "Still in progress. Working late. Tell you about it Sunday." Another buzz. "Meredith wants to know if you'd like her to bring anything for dinner, and if you're free Saturday to help choose paint colors for the guest room." I smiled, remembering how such requests once would have been assumptions rather than questions. How my time and preferences had been afterthoughts at best. The shift was small but significant. "Just yourselves for dinner. And yes to Saturday if we finish in court tomorrow. Otherwise might need to reschedule." I set the phone aside, returning to the documents before me. Across the table, Sarah was highlighting passages in a deposition, her focus absolute. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, determined, meticulous burning with purpose. "You're good at this," I said quietly. "Very good." She looked up surprised. "Thank you. That means a lot, especially from you. You would have been good with or without my input," I told her honestly. "But I'm glad to be here." "Can I ask you something?" she said, setting down her highlighter. "Why did you step away from law, I mean? Aunt Maggie said you were on track to become one of the top civil rights attorneys in the state. Then you just stopped." It was a question I had been asking myself with increasing frequency these past months. The answer wasn't simple, wasn't a single decision point, but a gradual erosion. Life happened, I said finally. My husband died. I sold our house to downsize. I moved in with my son, temporarily. I made air quotes around the word, and somewhere along the way it became easier to be useful than to be accomplished, to be needed than to be respected. Sarah nodded slowly. I can understand that, but why stay silent about who you were? Why let them believe you were less? I considered this carefully. Partly to keep peace, partly because it seemed unimportant to assert myself once I'd stepped away from practice. But mostly I think I stopped believing my own story. I let their perception become my reality. And now I'm remembering, I said simply. Not just who I was, but who I am. What I know. What I can still contribute. She smiled a bright, genuine expression that reminded me of the satisfaction I once took in mentoring younger attorneys. Well, I'm grateful for whatever led you back. This case wouldn't be the same without you. We returned to our work, but her question lingered in my mind. Why had I allowed myself to become invisible? Why had I surrendered my identity so completely? The answers weren't flattering, but they were illuminating, revealing patterns of accommodation, of self-erasure, of prioritizing others' comfort over my own truth. Patterns I was now consciously breaking, one court appearance, one conversation, one decision at a time. The case continued for 3 more days, longer than expected, but shorter than many I had handled in my active career. Judge Martinez ruled in our favor, ordering a phased approach to renovations that would allow current tenants to remain in the building with controlled rent increases for a minimum of 5 years. Not a complete victory, but a significant one that would give the elderly residents time to plan to adapt to maintain their community while exploring longer-term options. As we left the courthouse after the ruling, Eleanor Patterson took my hand in both of hers, her grip surprisingly strong for someone her age. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing us, for making them see us." I squeezed her hands gently. "You did that yourself, Eleanor. You stood up and demanded to be seen." She laughed softly. "Takes one to know one, doesn't it? I could tell the moment I met you another woman who'd been pushed to the margins but refused to stay there. Her perception startled me. Is it that obvious? Only to those who've experienced it," she replied. "There's a particular look in the eyes, a kind of renewed determination, like someone who's remembered their own name after forgetting it for a while." I walked with her to the taxi stand, listening, as she described her plans now that she could stay in her apartment. She spoke of organizing the tenants into a more formal association, of creating a community garden on the building's roof, of starting an oral history project to document the neighborhood's changes over decades. "I've got time now," she said as she settled into the taxi. "Might as well use it for something worthwhile." As I watched her drive away, I felt a profound sense of connection to Eleanor, to the other tenants, to Sarah and Maggie, to the long line of people who had entered courtrooms, seeking justice rather than mere legal outcomes. This wasn't just about housing or contracts or property rights. It was about dignity, about being seen, about occupying space without apology, the very things I had been reclaiming in my own life. I declined Maggie's offer of a celebratory dinner, promising to join her the following week. Instead, tonight I wanted solitude, not isolation, but the particular quiet that allows for reflection, for integration, for acknowledging transitions. At home, I kicked off my shoes and moved through rooms that were increasingly reflecting my preferences rather than Meredith's. The dining room walls now glowed warm terracotta in the evening light. The living room furniture had been rearranged to create conversation areas rather than showcase pieces. Books filled shelves that had once held decorative objects, chosen for their color coordination rather than meaning. In the kitchen, I poured a glass of wine and carried it to the patio, settling into what had become my favorite evening ritual. The garden was transitioning from summer to fall, the flowers fewer, but the colors deeper, more intense. I had added wind chimes that sang softly in the evening breeze and solar lights that created pools of gentle illumination along the stone path. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Judge Martinez's clerk just called. The defendants are already filing an appeal, but she doesn't think they have strong grounds. Thank you again for everything this week. I replied with a simple thumbs-up emoji, knowing there would be more conversations, more strategy sessions in the days ahead. The case wasn't fully resolved, but we had established important principles, created space for dialogue, demonstrated that elderly tenants couldn't simply be discarded for the sake of profit. Small victories, but meaningful ones. As darkness settled around me, I reflected on the past months, the gradual transformation from invisible to visible, from background to foreground, from silent to voiced. Not just in my relationship with James and Meredith, but in my sense of self, in my connection to my own history and capabilities. I thought of Eleanor Patterson's words. Like someone who's remembered their own name after forgetting it for a while. That was exactly how it felt. A remembering, a recognition, a reclaiming. The woman who had folded laundry and set tables and disappeared when guests arrived still existed. But she was no longer my entire identity. She was simply one facet of a more complex, more complete person who had emerged from years of self-imposed diminishment. I didn't resent the woman I had been. She had done what seemed necessary at the time, adapting to circumstances, preserving peace, finding value in service. But I was grateful to have rediscovered the woman beneath that careful accommodation, the one who spoke with authority, who stood her ground, who remembered that her story didn't begin or end with motherhood or widowhood or retirement. The coolness of evening settled around me as stars appeared overhead. I remained on the patio listening to the night sounds, distant traffic, the neighbors' wind chimes, the rustle of leaves in the garden. Sounds that had always been there, but that I was hearing with renewed attention, with rekindled presence. This, too, was part of reclaiming myself, not just the professional re-engagement or the relational renegotiation, but the simple act of being fully present in my own life, of noticing, of savoring, of inhabiting each moment rather than merely enduring it. When my wine glass was empty and the night air had grown too cool for comfort, I went inside, closing the patio door behind me with a soft click. The house embraced me not as a guest or a caretaker or an afterthought, but as its rightful center, its heart. In my bedroom, I opened the wooden box once more, running my fingers over the contents with familiar reverence. But tonight I added something new. A copy of Judge Martinez's ruling, fresh from the courthouse printer, with my name listed among the legal advisors to the case. Not the lead attorney, not the central figure, but present, acknowledged, counted. It felt like both an ending and a beginning. The conclusion of my invisibility and the start of whatever came next. A next that I would shape deliberately, consciously, with the wisdom of a woman who had learned the hard way that silence serves no one, least of all oneself. Autumn settled over the city, bringing crisp mornings and golden afternoons that set the maple trees aflame with color. My life developed new rhythms 3 days a week. At the Legal Aid Society, regular dinners with James and Meredith. At their new home, occasional lunches with Maggie and other former colleagues. Weekly walks with Eleanor Patterson, who had become an unexpected friend. I had transformed the extra bedroom James's old room into a home office, complete with a proper desk, comfortable chair, and bookshelves filled with legal texts I'd retrieved from storage. On the wall hung my framed law degree and bar certification, no longer hidden in a box but displayed with neither apology nor pride, simply as facts as parts of my story. October brought an invitation I hadn't anticipated, a request from the local university's law school to speak to a class on housing discrimination, sharing insights from both my earlier career and the recent case with Eleanor and the other tenants. Sarah had recommended me to the professor, describing me in terms that made me blush when she forwarded the email. Catherine Mitchell's approach to humanizing legal arguments offers a master class in effective advocacy. I accepted with a mix of trepidation and excitement. It had been years since I'd spoken formally about my work, years since I'd considered my experiences worth sharing. But as I prepared my notes, organizing thoughts on the intersection of law economics and human dignity, I found the material flowing easily, naturally, as if it had been waiting for this opportunity. The morning of the lecture, I stood before my closet, considering options with more care than usual. Not out of vanity, but out of respect for the occasion, for the students who would listen, for the subject matter's importance, for my own re-emergence into professional visibility. I selected a deep plum blazer over a gray silk blouse, classic black trousers and low heels. Professional but not severe. Present but not demanding attention. As I fastened a silver pendant necklace, a gift from Richard, on our 20th anniversary, I caught myself smiling at the reflection that looked back at me. A woman comfortable in her skin, in her knowledge, in her place in the world. The law school campus was buzzing with the particular energy of academic pursuit students, hurrying between classes, clutching coffee cups and laptops, voices animated with debate and discussion. I felt a familiar stirring of intellectual engagement, of being in a place where ideas mattered, where minds were engaged in questioning, exploring, challenging. Professor Lynn met me outside the classroom, a woman perhaps 15 years my junior with keen eyes and a firm handshake. "Mrs. Mitchell, thank you so much for coming. The students have read about the Patterson case and they're eager to hear your perspective. Please call me Catherine," I said, following her into the classroom, where about 30 students were settling into their seats. Most looked to be in their mid-20s, though. A few appeared older, perhaps, second career students like I had been. As Professor Lynn introduced me, outlining my legal background and recent work, I surveyed the faces before me, attentive, curious, some already taking notes. In the back row sat a familiar figure, Meredith, quietly slipping in just before the lecture began. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave a small wave, her expression a mix of support and something else I couldn't quite identify. I hadn't known she was coming, hadn't mentioned the lecture to her or James, not out of secrecy, but because it hadn't seemed significant enough to highlight during our weekly dinner together. Yet here she was, notepad in hand, attention focused. Setting aside my surprise, I began speaking, describing the Patterson case, not just in legal terms, but in human ones. I explained how Eleanor and the other tenants had been systematically rendered invisible by development plans, that saw them only as obstacles, rather than as people with history's connections needs. The law provides frameworks. I told the students, but justice requires recognition. It requires seeing beyond statutes and precedents to the actual lives affected by our legal decisions. For nearly an hour, I spoke about the case's details, the strategies we employed, the broader implications for housing policy and elder rights. The students asked thoughtful questions about gentrification, about the limits of property rights, about balancing economic development with community preservation. I answered carefully but confidently, drawing on both academic knowledge and practical experience, on theory and lived reality. It felt like slipping into a familiar coat that still fit perfectly the intellectual rigor, the precise language, the careful building of argument upon fact upon principle. When the session ended, several students approached with follow-up questions. I spoke with each one, noticing how they straightened slightly when I addressed them directly, how they engaged more deeply when they felt truly heard. After the last student departed, Meredith approached her expression thoughtful. That was... She began, then paused as if searching for the right words. You were remarkable, Catherine. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched by her presence. I didn't know you were coming. She shifted her weight slightly, a gesture I recognized as discomfort. Sarah mentioned it when I ran into her at that cafe near my office. I hope you don't mind that I came. Of course not. I'm just surprised. I wanted to see you in your element, she said simply. To understand better who you were, who you are beyond our home. The acknowledgement was small but significant, a recognition that my identity extended beyond the roles she had assigned me, that I existed in contexts where my experience and knowledge were valuable rather than incidental. Would you like to get lunch? I asked, gathering my notes. There's a decent cafe just across the quad. She smiled, a genuine expression without the careful social calculation I was accustomed to seeing. I'd like that very much. Over soup and sandwiches, she asked questions about my legal career, not out of politeness, but with real curiosity. How had I balanced work and family? What cases had meant the most to me? What had drawn me to discrimination law, specifically? I answered openly, sharing stories I hadn't spoken aloud in years. The challenges of being one of the few women in courtrooms dominated by men, the satisfaction of helping clients achieve justice, the frustrations of systemic barriers that legal victories alone couldn't dismantle. I had no idea, she said, finally stirring her coffee thoughtfully. All this time, and I never really knew who was living in our home. To be fair, I replied, I didn't exactly make it easy to see. I presented the version of myself I thought would fit most comfortably into your lives. She nodded, acknowledging the truth in this. But I never asked, did I? I just assumed. We all make assumptions, I said. The question is whether we're willing to correct them when evidence contradicts our preconceptions. And am I correcting them? She asked, a rare vulnerability in her voice. I considered her question carefully. Our relationship had evolved significantly since the night of her dinner party, since my quiet revelation of who I had been before becoming her mother-in-law. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by a tentative respect. The assumption of my availability had shifted to genuine requests. The relegation to background had given way to more equitable footing. Yes, I said finally. You are. We both are. Relief flickered across her face, followed by something that looked like determination. I want to get this right, Catherine. I want to be better than I was. We're all works in progress." I told her, surprised by the genuine affection I felt in that moment. Not forgetting the past, but not held prisoner by it either. Moving forward with clearer vision, with mutual recognition. As we walked back to the parking lot, Meredith hesitated, then asked, "Would you consider doing more of this? Teaching, I mean. Or consulting? You're clearly still at the top of your game." The compliment warmed me. "I'm exploring possibilities," I admitted. "The legal aid work is fulfilling, but yes, there might be other ways to share what I know." "For what it's worth," she said as we reached our cars. "I think you should. The students today, they were captivated. You have something valuable to offer." We parted with a brief hug, not our usual air kiss goodbye, but a real embrace, however quick. As I drove home, I reflected on the unexpected turn the day had taken. Not just the successful lecture, but Meredith's presence, her genuine interest, her encouragement. Another small step in the reconstruction of our relationship. Another piece of myself reclaimed and recognized. At home, I found an email waiting from Professor Lin, thanking me for the lecture and inquiring about my interest in guest teaching, a short series on practical applications of civil rights law later in the semester. I responded immediately, accepting with both gratitude and excitement. Then I called Maggie, eager to share the day's developments. As the phone rang, I gazed out at my garden at the maple tree, whose leaves had turned brilliant crimson, at the late roses still blooming despite the cooling temperatures. Life, I reflected, had a way of opening new doors just when you thought all possibilities had narrowed to a single path. All it required was the courage to step through them, to reclaim spaces you had surrendered to, insist quietly but firmly on being seen. The holidays approached with their usual mix of anticipation and complexity. Thanksgiving would be at James and Meredith's new home, their first major holiday, as hosts in their own space. Christmas was still undecided, though. Meredith had hinted at a possible ski trip that would include me if I was interested. The shift was subtle but profound, from being the default holiday facilitator, the cook and cleaner and background figure, to being an actively invited participant in plans I hadn't been expected to execute. 2 days before Thanksgiving, I was preparing a pumpkin pie to bring to their dinner, my contribution rather than my obligation, when the phone rang. Sarah Chen's name appeared on the screen. "Catherine," she said when I answered, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Are you sitting down? Should I be—" I asked, wiping flour from my hands. "Maybe." "Victor Harmon just called. The development company wants to propose a completely new settlement for the Patterson case." I set down my rolling pin. "What kind of settlement?" "A cooperative ownership model. They're offering to convert the building to condos as planned, but with a special program for existing tenants, heavily subsidized purchase options, maintenance fees, scaled to income, and a shared equity arrangement for common areas." "That's unexpected," I said, mind racing to assess the implications. "What changed?" "Apparently, the publicity from the case has made other developments difficult for them. Community resistance protesters at planning meetings, negative press. They're hoping this will repair their image while still allowing for profitability through the units not occupied by current tenants." "Have you spoken to Eleanor yet?" "Briefly. She's cautiously interested, but wants your assessment before they proceed with discussions." I felt a surge of pride that Eleanor trusted my judgment so completely, followed by the familiar analytical focus that had characterized my professional life for decades. "I'll review the proposal if you want to email it over," I said. And I can meet with Eleanor and the tenant association tomorrow if that works. Already sent it, Sarah replied. And they've scheduled a meeting for 10 tomorrow at the community center. Can you make it? I'll be there, I promised. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and found Sarah's email, waiting with the settlement proposal attached. For the next 2 hours, I forgot about the pie dough slowly warming on the counter as I immersed myself in legal language, financial projections, ownership structures, and governance models. The proposal was surprisingly comprehensive and more generous than I had expected from Victor Harmon's firm. Not perfect, certainly. There were conditions and caveats that would need careful negotiation. But as a starting point, it offered something revolutionary, a path for elderly fixed-income tenants to build equity while maintaining their community, their connections, their sense of place. I made extensive notes highlighting areas of concern and opportunities for improvement, drawing on both my legal training and my understanding of the tenant's specific needs. By the time I looked up, the evening had deepened around me, the kitchen windows reflecting my image back against the darkness outside. I returned to the abandoned pie dough, which had grown too warm for proper handling. Rather than attempting to salvage it, I wrapped it and placed it in the refrigerator for another day. Then I made a simple dinner and took it to my office eating, while I continued reviewing documents. Around 9, my phone buzzed with a text from James. Everything okay? Usually hear from you by now about Thanksgiving plans. I smiled at his concern, genuine, rather than performative, and replied, all fine. Working on an unexpected development in the Patterson case. Will call tomorrow. His response came quickly. Mom the lawyer back in action. Can't wait to hear about it. The simple acknowledgement, Mom the lawyer, struck me with unexpected force. Not Mom alone, not defined solely by relation to him, but recognized in my professional capacity as well. The integration of identities I had once kept carefully separated mother and attorney nurturer and advocate. I returned to my work with renewed focus, preparing questions and considerations for the tenant meeting the following day. This was what engagement felt like, this full attention, this stretching of mental faculties, this sense of purpose extending beyond my own immediate concerns. This was what I had surrendered in those quiet years of self-erasure. And this was what I had reclaimed, step by careful step, since the night I had opened the wooden box and remembered who I was. The next morning I dressed with particular care, a navy suit that communicated authority without aggression, comfortable but professional shoes, minimal jewelry that wouldn't distract during negotiations. I gathered my notes, my marked-up copy of the proposal, and a legal pad for additional observations. At the community center, I found Eleanor already holding court at a long table surrounded by a dozen other tenants from the building. Despite her age, she projected a natural leadership that reminded me of senior partners I had worked with, an easy authority born of experience and quiet confidence. "Catherine," she called when she saw me gesturing to an empty chair beside her. "We've been waiting for our expert." I slid into the seat, greeting the other tenants with warm handshakes. Many I recognized from the court proceedings, though some were new faces, perhaps those who had been too frail or intimidated to attend the hearings. "I've reviewed the proposal." I began without preamble. "It's better than I expected, but there are several areas that need strengthening to truly protect your interests." For the next hour, I walked them through the documents section by section, explaining legal implications in plain language, identifying potential pitfalls, suggesting alternative language where necessary. The tenants asked thoughtful questions, raised specific concerns about their individual situations, and demonstrated a collective wisdom about their community's needs that no outside expert could have matched. So you think we should consider it? Eleanor asked after we had thoroughly dissected the proposal. This isn't just a PR move that will leave us worse off. If properly negotiated and documented, this could provide something none of us expected from this case. Actual ownership stakes rather than merely extended tenancy, I replied. But everything depends on the details. The devil, as they say, is in the fine print. And you'll help us with that fine print? She asked, though it wasn't really a question. We both knew I was committed, now invested in these people and their futures. Every word of it, I promised. Sarah arrived shortly after with Victor Harmon and 2 representatives from the development company. The dynamic had shifted noticeably since our courtroom confrontation. Harmon was still polished and professional, but the dismissive edge was gone, replaced by something closer to cautious respect. Mrs. Mitchell, he acknowledged as we arranged ourselves on opposite sides of the table. I understand you've been advising the tenants. I have, I replied simply. They've reviewed your proposal and have some questions and suggestions. The negotiation that followed was a dance of interests and priorities of legal requirements and human needs of financial realities and community values. I led the discussion for our side with Eleanor and other tenants, contributing specific points related to their situations. Victor Harmon was a skilled attorney, I had to give him that. He advocated firmly for his clients' interests, while demonstrating more flexibility than I had initially expected. Perhaps the public relations damage had been significant enough to warrant genuine compromise. Or perhaps he had been affected by the humanity of the tenants who had stood before the court with such dignity. By early afternoon, we had outlined a revised framework that addressed most of our concerns, strengthened protections against future conversions, clearer language on maintenance obligations, better terms for the subsidized purchase options, and a more equitable governance structure for the proposed cooperative. We'll need to formalize this, of course, Harmon said as we concluded. Draft the full agreement for review by all parties. Of course, I agreed. Sarah will coordinate with your office on the drafting process, and I'll continue advising the tenant association through completion. He nodded, then added with a hint of grudging admiration. You haven't lost your touch, Mrs. Mitchell. The Meridian case was required reading when I was in law school. The reference to one of my most significant professional achievements, a landmark workplace discrimination case that had established important precedents for gender equity, caught me by surprise. That was a long time ago, I said. Good legal work stands the test of time, he replied. My father opposed you in the Westlake case. He said you were the most meticulously prepared attorney he ever faced. Robert Harmon was a formidable opponent. I acknowledged. I'm glad to hear he remembered our encounters. Remembered and respected, Victor corrected. Though he wouldn't have admitted it publicly at the time. The conversation shifted something between us, not friendship exactly, but a professional recognition that transcended our opposing positions. As he gathered his materials to leave, he extended his hand. I look forward to finalizing this agreement, he said. It's not often a contentious case resolves with both sides feeling they've achieved something meaningful. After the developers and their attorney departed, the tenants erupted in excited conversation, discussing what the settlement would mean for their futures, how ownership would change their relationship to their homes, what responsibilities they would now share. Eleanor squeezed my hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing possibilities none of us imagined. You did the hard part," I reminded her, standing up, speaking out, refusing to be dismissed. "We make a good team," she replied with a smile. "The women who refuse to fade away." Later that evening, as I finally returned to my abandoned pie dough, I reflected on Eleanor's words. The women who refuse to fade away. It wasn't about resisting aging or change. Those were inevitable natural processes. It was about refusing to be rendered invisible before our time, about insisting on recognition as full participants in the world, rather than as background figures in someone else's narrative. I shaped the dough into a perfect circle, crimped the edges with practiced fingers, and filled it with the pumpkin mixture I had prepared that morning. As I slid it into the oven, I thought about the Thanksgiving ahead, not as the woman who would cook and serve and clean while others celebrated, but as a guest bringing one contribution to a shared table. A shift from obligation to choice, from service to participation. My phone buzzed with a text from Meredith. "Need any help with the pie? I could come by early tomorrow to assist if you'd like." Another small but significant change, offering help, rather than expecting it, acknowledging that even simple tasks might be shared, rather than automatically assigned based on age or gender or habit, all under control. I replied, "But thank you for offering. Looking forward to tomorrow." As the scent of baking pie filled the kitchen, I opened my laptop to find an email from Professor Lin confirming the dates for the guest lecture series I had agreed to teach in the spring semester. 4 sessions on practical applications of civil rights law, drawing on my experiences with cases like Meridian Textiles, Westlake, and now Patterson. Another email followed from Sarah, attaching the first draft of the formal settlement agreement for my review, with a note of profound thanks for my involvement in the case. A text appeared from James confirming what time he would pick me up for Thanksgiving dinner, adding, "Meredith's nervous about hosting. Says she can't compete with your cooking. Told her it's not a competition." And finally, a voicemail from Maggie inviting me to join her firm's holiday party as her guest, a gathering of legal professionals, where I would once again be among peers, rather than merely someone's mother or mother-in-law. All these threads connecting me to the world not as an appendage or a helper or a background figure, but as myself, Catherine Mitchell, mother and attorney advisor and friend woman, with a past worth acknowledging and a future still unfolding. I checked the pie, its surface turning golden in the oven's heat. Perfect or near enough. Like life itself, not flawless, but rich with possibility, complex in flavor, requiring attention but rewarding care. The woman who had once folded herself into silence was speaking again, not loudly, not demandingly, but clearly, truthfully, with the quiet authority of someone who had remembered her own worth, and remarkably, wonderfully, the world was listening. Not because I had shouted or demanded attention, but because I had simply refused to remain invisible. Because I had reminded others and myself of a fundamental truth, too easily forgotten. We do not become less valuable as we age. We do not become less entitled to recognition as we step back from career or public roles. We do not become less worthy of being seen, heard, respected. The pie timer chimed, calling me back to the present moment. Tomorrow would be Thanksgiving, and I had much to be grateful for. Not least the recovery of my voice, my space, myself. The simple, profound gift of once again being fully visible. Not just to others, but to myself.